He thought he had seen every version of lost money slipping through deals, partners walking away, markets crashing overnight, but nothing had ever prepared him for the moment a quiet voice said, "Your wine, sir." And he looked up to find the one woman he had erased from his life, standing right in front of him carrying his child. The restaurant glowed in soft amber light, the kind that made everything feel expensive and distant, crystal glasses catching reflections like fragments of another world, low jazz threading through conversations that never rose above a polite hum. And Ethan Blake sat at the center of it all like he always did, tailored suit, silver watch, the quiet gravity of a man used to being recognized before he spoke. But none of that mattered the second his eyes landed on her. Ava Carter didn't freeze, didn't drop the tray, didn't even blink longer than necessary. She set the glass down with steady hands, the same careful precision she gave every table. But the curve beneath her uniform was impossible to ignore, the soft, undeniable rise of a pregnancy that did not belong in a place like this. Not in a room where people paid hundreds of dollars for a single meal and never thought about the lives serving them. For a moment, the sound drained out of Ethan's world, replaced by the slow, heavy beat of his own pulse. Because Ava wasn't supposed to be here, not like this, not after everything that had been signed, finalized, and buried 2 years ago in a conference room that smelled like polished wood and cold decisions. "Is there anything else I can get you?" she asked, her voice calm, professional, as if he were just another customer passing through her shift. And that was what struck him the hardest, not anger, not tears, but the complete absence of recognition in her tone, like he had already been filed away into a past that no longer held power over her. At the table beside him, someone snapped their fingers lightly. "Miss, can we get another round over here?" And Ava turned without hesitation, nodding, moving with quiet efficiency, leaving Ethan sitting there with a question lodged in his chest that felt heavier than any deal he had ever negotiated, because the world he controlled ran on answers, on leverage, on knowing exactly where every piece stood, and right now he knew nothing. He watched her cross the room, weaving through tables, balancing trays, carrying herself with a kind of restrained strength that didn't ask for attention but demanded respect anyway. And it didn't match the version of her he remembered, the woman who used to stand beside him in rooms like this, not serving, but being served, not overlooked, but introduced. And the contrast hit like a quiet fracture spreading beneath everything he thought was solid. A man at another table laughed too loudly, barely glancing at her as he handed off his order, and something in Ethan tightened. Not quite anger, not yet, but something unfamiliar, something closer to discomfort than control, because for the first time he was seeing her through the eyes of a room that didn't know her name, didn't know her past, didn't know that the life she carried might be tied to him in ways he had never allowed himself to consider. When she returned to his table, he spoke before he could stop himself, his voice lower than usual, stripped of its usual edge. "Ava." She paused just slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to know she had heard him as more than a customer. Her eyes meeting his for a brief second, steady, unreadable, and then she said quietly, "If you need something, you can let me know." And in that moment, with the lights reflecting off glass and strangers filling the space between them, Ethan Blake realized something he had never felt before in any boardroom, any negotiation, any victory he had ever claimed. He was no longer the one in control. The air did not return to normal after that moment. It shifted, subtle but undeniable, like something fragile had been cracked open in a room that prided itself on perfection, and Ethan could not bring himself to look away as Ava moved from table to table, her steps measured, her posture straight, her presence quiet but unshakable, and every time she passed near him the same thought pressed harder against his chest, a question he had no right to ask, but could not silence, because the curve beneath her uniform was no longer just a detail. It was a truth standing in plain sight. He pushed his chair back slightly, the faint scrape against the polished floor barely audible beneath the music, and for the first time in years he ignored the phone vibrating in his pocket, ignored the messages that would normally command his attention without hesitation, because none of it felt relevant compared to the woman who had once shared his life and now carried a version of it forward without him. When Ava returned again, this time with a small leather folder for the check, he spoke before the distance could settle back in place. his voice controlled but stripped of its usual certainty. "We need to talk." She did not flinch, did not react the way he remembered from arguments that used to echo through glass walls and late nights. She simply set the folder down and replied, "I am working." Her tone even, not cold, not warm, just final, like a door that had already been closed long before he realized he was outside of it. Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning forward just enough to lower his voice beneath the reach of nearby tables. "Ava, please." And the words sounded unfamiliar even to him. Because he did not ask, he decided, he directed, he moved outcomes into place. But this was different. This was something that did not respond to pressure or position. She looked at him then, fully this time, her eyes steady, clear, and far more distant than any anger could have created, and for a second the noise of the restaurant seemed to thin again, leaving only the space between them. "You made your decisions," she said quietly. "I made mine." And the simplicity of it landed harder than any accusation. He swallowed, his gaze dropping briefly to her hands, noticing the absence of anything that tied her to him. No ring, no trace, nothing except the life she carried. And when he looked back up, the question slipped out before he could measure it. "Is it mine?" The words hung there, too direct, too late, and Ava did not react with shock or offense. She simply held his gaze and answered in the same calm tone she had used all night. "You do not get to ask me that here." And something in her voice made it clear that the location was not the issue, it was him. A burst of laughter rose from a nearby table, someone calling for another drink, and the world rushed back and around them. But Ethan felt separated from it, as if he were standing just outside his own life watching it unfold without the control he had always relied on. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a black card and placing it on the table without looking away from her. "You do not have to be here," he said, the words coming out softer than intended. "Whatever you need, I can take care of it." And for a moment, just a moment, there was a flicker of something in her expression, not hesitation, not temptation, but recognition of exactly what he was trying to do. And she reached down, picked up the card, and placed it back in front of him with steady fingers. "That is exactly why I am here," she replied, her voice quiet but unbreakable. "Because I am not something you can take care of anymore." And then she turned, walking away before he could respond, leaving him with a card he had used to solve every problem in his life, and the realization that for the first time, it meant absolutely nothing. The card remained on the table long after she walked away, a small, weightless piece of metal that had once carried more authority than words, and Ethan stared at it like it had betrayed him, like it had failed to do the one thing it had always guaranteed, control, because in every room he had ever stepped into before tonight, money was not just currency, it was leverage, it was certainty, it was the quiet assurance that nothing was ever truly out of reach, but Ava had just handed it back. Without hesitation, without negotiation, without even the slightest pause, and that absence of reaction unsettled him more than rejection ever could. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze following her again as she moved through the room. But this time he noticed things he had not allowed himself to see before. The way she adjusted her balance slightly with each step, the way her hand rested briefly against the edge of a table as if grounding herself, the way she exhaled slowly when she thought no one was paying attention, and something about it shifted the weight inside his chest. Because it was no longer just about her being here, it was about how long she had been here, how long she had been doing this without him even knowing. A sharp voice cut through the low hum nearby. "Hey, we have been waiting." And Ethan's attention snapped to the table across the aisle where a man in an expensive blazer gestured impatiently toward Ava as she approached with a tray, his tone not loud enough to cause a scene, but careless enough to reveal exactly how little he saw her, and Ethan watched as she responded with the same composed professionalism. "I will be right with you, sir." Her voice steady, respectful, controlled, and it struck him again how easily the room accepted that version of her, how quickly the world had rewritten her role without question. The man let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "You people always say that." And while the words were casual, almost dismissive, something in the phrasing lingered in the air longer than it should have. And for the first time that night, Ethan felt something sharper than confusion rise beneath his calm, something that did not belong to strategy or logic, but to instinct, and it caught him off guard. Ava did not react, did not correct him, did not even acknowledge the tone beneath the words. She simply nodded once and turned to retrieve the order, and that silence, that refusal to engage, carried more weight than any argument. Because it was not submission, it was distance. It was a boundary that did not need to be spoken out loud. Ethan's hand tightened slightly against the edge of the table, his gaze fixed on the interaction longer than necessary, and he realized with a quiet, uncomfortable clarity that she had been navigating moments like this alone, that whatever strength he was seeing now was not new. It was built, refined, practiced in spaces he had never bothered to imagine. When she returned again, passing by him without stopping, he spoke her name once more, softer this time. Not a command, not even a request, just recognition. Ava. And she slowed for a fraction of a second before continuing forward, not turning, not responding, but not ignoring him either, as if acknowledging that he was there without giving him access to anything beyond that. And it left him sitting in a silence that felt heavier than the noise around him. For the first time in years, Ethan Blake did not know how to move the next step forward, because every instinct he had was built on solving problems, on identifying leverage, on closing distance. But there was no leverage here, no shortcut, no strategy that could rewrite the fact that she had built a life beyond him, one that did not bend just because he had finally decided to look back. And as he sat there watching her disappear into the rhythm of the restaurant once more, he began to understand something that no negotiation had ever taught him. Some distances were not created by space. They were created by choices, and they could not be closed the same way they were broken. The rhythm of the restaurant continued as if nothing had shifted. Plates moved, glasses refilled, quiet laughter rising and falling beneath the soft music. But for Ethan, the entire room had narrowed to one repeating pattern: Ava crossing his line of sight, disappearing, and returning again, each pass carving something deeper into his awareness, something he could no longer ignore or explain away. And it was not just her presence. It was the way she carried it, controlled, deliberate, untouched by the weight he could feel pressing into his own chest. He reached for his glass but did not drink, his fingers pausing against the cool surface as his eyes followed her once more. And this time he noticed the smallest break in her composure, a subtle pause near the service station where she placed a hand briefly against the counter, her shoulders lifting with a slow breath before she straightened again. And it lasted no more than 2 seconds, so small that no one else in the room reacted. But to him it felt like a signal he had missed too many times before, a quiet reminder that strength did not mean the absence of strain. The kitchen doors swung open and closed behind her, bursts of brighter light spilling into the darker dining area. And for a moment she disappeared behind them, leaving him staring at an empty space that felt heavier than her presence had. Because now there was nothing to watch, nothing to measure, only the echo of what he had seen and the growing realization that whatever story he had told himself about the past had been incomplete. He stood before he fully decided to, the movement instinctive, pulling his jacket into place as he stepped away from the table, ignoring the curious glance from the server passing by, and moved toward the back of the restaurant, toward the thin line that separated the polished front from the working reality behind it. The air shifted as soon as he crossed through the doors, warmer, louder, filled with the clatter of dishes and the sharp rhythm of orders being called out. A different world from the controlled calm he had been sitting in, and there, just a few feet away, Ava stood near a stainless steel counter, her head slightly lowered as she pressed her fingers gently against her side, her breathing slower now, measured, deliberate. And for the first time since he had seen her, she looked human in a way that the dining room had not allowed, not diminished, not weak, but unguarded for a fraction of a second. He stopped, not close enough to startle her, not far enough to pretend he had not seen, and something in him shifted again, because this was not a version of her that could be addressed with a card or a solution. This was something that required presence, something he had never learned how to offer. "You should not be doing this alone," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the noise just enough to reach her. And she lifted her head, turning toward him with that same steady expression, returning almost instantly, like a door closing the moment it had been opened. "I am not alone," she replied, her hand resting lightly over her stomach as she straightened, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than anything else she had said. because it redefined everything in a single line. She was not waiting, not lacking, not incomplete. She had already built a world that did not require him. Ethan took a step closer, the distance between them smaller now, but no less significant. "That is not what I meant," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were insufficient, shaped by a perspective that no longer fit the reality in front of him. Ava held his gaze for a moment longer, her eyes calm, clear, and entirely her own, before she spoke again, her voice low but unwavering. "You do not get to decide what I need anymore." And with that, she turned back to her work, picking up a tray, adjusting her balance, and moving forward without hesitation, leaving him standing in a space that no longer responded to his presence, surrounded by noise, motion, and the undeniable truth that for the first time in his life, he was not the center of the story unfolding in front of him. The kitchen noise did not soften after she walked away. It pressed in around Ethan, metal against metal, voices layered over one another, orders called out with precision that left no space for hesitation. And for a moment he stood there out of place, a man built for quiet boardrooms and controlled environments, now surrounded by a rhythm that did not adjust for him, did not recognize him, did not care who he was outside those doors. He stepped back slowly, the weight of Ava's words settling in deeper than he expected, not because they were loud, but because they were final. And as he pushed back through the swinging doors into the dining room, the contrast struck him harder than before. The soft lighting, the measured conversations, the illusion of ease that suddenly felt artificial compared to the reality he had just witnessed behind it. He returned to his table but did not sit immediately, his eyes scanning the room until they found her again, moving with the same quiet focus, carrying a tray toward the table that had earlier demanded her attention. And this time he noticed the details he had ignored before, the slight shift in her posture as she balanced the weight, the way she angled her body to move through narrow spaces without drawing attention, the discipline in every motion that came from repetition, from necessity, from doing something not because it was chosen, but because it had to be done. The man at that table glanced up as she approached, barely pausing his conversation, and when she set the plates down he gestured vaguely toward one of them. "That is not what I ordered," his tone flat, impatient, and Ava did not argue, did not defend herself. She simply nodded once and said, "I will fix it," already reaching to correct the mistake, already moving forward, and something in Ethan tightened again, not because of the mistake, but because of how easily the moment passed for everyone except him, how quickly it became just another small inconvenience in a room full of people. Who would forget it seconds later? He pulled out his chair and sat down, but his posture had changed, less relaxed, more alert, as if something inside him had shifted from observation to awareness. And when Ava passed by his table again he spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, but clearly enough that she could not pretend she had not heard him. "When does your shift end?" She stopped this time, just for a second, her back still to him, her hand steady on the tray, and then she turned slightly, her expression composed, her voice even. "That is not something you need to know." And the response was not defensive. It was boundary, clean and unyielding. Ethan nodded once, absorbing it, adjusting without argument. And for the first time he did not try to push past it, did not try to redirect or persuade. He simply said, "Then I will wait." And the words surprised even him, because they were not strategic, they were not calculated, they were patient in a way he had never been before. Ava held his gaze for a moment longer, searching perhaps for the angle, the leverage, the intention behind it, but finding none that fit what she expected, and without responding she turned and continued her work, leaving him at the table with a decision he had not planned to make, but could not take back. Minutes stretched longer than they should have, the meal in front of him untouched, the conversations around him fading into background noise as he remained seated, not out of habit, not out of obligation, but because for the first time he understood that whatever came next would not be decided on his terms, and that waiting, something he had always considered a weakness, might be the only way forward. Time moved differently after that, not marked by minutes or courses being served, but by the quiet persistence of Ethan remaining exactly where he said he would be, his untouched plate cooling in front of him, his phone face down on the table, ignored despite the occasional vibration that would have once pulled his attention instantly. And the longer he sat there, the more the room seemed to adjust around him, not in recognition, but in contrast, because everything continued as usual while he remained still, a fixed point in a space built on movement. Ava noticed, not immediately, not with any visible reaction, but in the subtle shifts of her awareness, the way her eyes passed over his table more than once without lingering, the way she recalibrated her path through the room to avoid unnecessary proximity, and yet he was still there each time, unchanged, unmoving, and that consistency carried a different kind of weight, one that was harder to dismiss than a question or an offer. The dinner rush began to thin, the volume of conversation lowering, chairs scraping softly against the floor as guests finished their meals and prepared to leave, and with it the pace of the staff adjusted, still busy but less urgent, more controlled, and Ava moved through it with the same quiet efficiency, clearing tables, resetting spaces, maintaining the rhythm she had built for herself long before tonight interrupted it. A manager approached her briefly near the service station, speaking in low tones, a quick exchange that ended with a nod from Ava and a glance toward the clock on the wall. And though Ethan could not hear the words, he recognized the shift, the nearing end of something. Not just her shift, but the distance between now and whatever came next. He leaned back slightly, exhaling a breath he had not realized he was holding. And for the first time since he had walked in, he allowed himself to look around the room without searching for her, noticing the details he would have once overlooked, the wear on the edges of chairs, the subtle imperfections in a place designed to feel flawless, the small realities that existed beneath presentation, and it mirrored something inside him, a recognition that not everything could be controlled or polished into something easier to accept. When Ava finally approached his table again, it was not with a tray or a task, but with a simple, professional composure, her hands empty, her posture steady, and she stopped just far enough away to keep the distance intact. "We are closing your table," she said calmly, her tone neutral, not dismissive, not inviting, just factual, and Ethan nodded once, reaching for his wallet before pausing, then pushing the check slightly forward instead of taking it. "I already took care of it," he said, quietly, and she glanced down briefly, acknowledging it with a small nod, nothing more. For a moment, neither of them moved, the space between them, filled with everything that had not been said, everything that could not be resolved in a single conversation. And then Ethan spoke again, not with the urgency from before, but with something steadier, something that resembled understanding. "I meant what I said." And Ava's expression did not change, but her eyes held his a fraction longer this time, measuring not the words, but the absence of force behind them. "So did I," she replied, her voice even, and there was no tension in it, no need to defend or explain, just truth placed quietly between them. She turned then, stepping back into motion, beginning the process of closing down the space, and Ethan did not follow, did not interrupt. He remained seated for a moment longer before finally standing, adjusting his jacket slowly, deliberately, as if giving himself time to accept what he could not change in that moment. He walked toward the exit without looking back immediately, the soft glow of the restaurant fading behind him as the cooler night air met him at the door, and only when he stepped outside did he pause, glancing back through the glass where he could see her moving inside, still working, still steady, still entirely separate from the world he had once assumed included him by default. And for the first time, he did not try to step back in. He simply waited just beyond the door, not because he expected an answer, but because he had finally learned that some things could not be rushed, only earned, one moment at a time. The night air carried a different kind of silence than the restaurant, cooler, wider, untouched by the controlled rhythm inside, and Ethan stood just beyond the glass doors with his hands resting loosely at his sides, not checking his watch, not reaching for his phone, simply remaining there as the minutes stretched into something unfamiliar, something that did not respond to urgency or expectation. And for the first time in a long time, he let them pass without trying to shape them into something useful. Inside, the lights dimmed slightly as the staff moved into closing routines, chairs being aligned, surfaces wiped down with quiet efficiency, and Ava was still there, moving through it all with the same steady pace, the same composure that had defined every step of her night, and even through the glass, even from a distance, he could see the difference between her world and his, not in value, but in weight. because everything she did carried necessity, purpose, and something he had not understood before, resilience that did not ask to be seen. A car pulled up along the curb, headlights briefly cutting across the window before moving on, and Ethan barely noticed, his focus fixed on the moment the door would open, not with anticipation, but with acceptance that whatever happened next would not be decided by him. When the door finally pushed open, it was not dramatic, not sudden, just a quiet shift as Ava stepped out into the night. A light jacket pulled over her uniform, her bag resting against her shoulder, one hand naturally finding the curve of her stomach as she paused for a second, adjusting to the change in temperature, and when she looked up, she saw him. There was no surprise in her expression, no sharp reaction, just a brief stillness as she took in the fact that he had stayed, and then she began walking forward, not toward him, but along the sidewalk, her path clear, her direction already chosen. Ethan stepped forward, matching her pace without blocking it, leaving enough space between them that her movement was never interrupted, and for a few steps neither of them spoke, the city sounds filling the gap, distant traffic, a passing conversation, the soft echo of footsteps against concrete. "You did not have to wait," she said finally, her voice calm, not accusing, just stating a fact, and Ethan nodded slightly, keeping his gaze forward rather than forcing it onto her. "I know," he replied, and the simplicity of the answer settled between them without resistance. They continued walking for another few steps, the distance between them consistent, deliberate, and then he spoke again, quieter this time. "I did not know." And this time she slowed, not stopping completely, but enough to acknowledge the words, her eyes shifting toward him briefly, measuring, not the sentence, but the intention behind it. "That does not change anything," she said, and there was no sharpness in it, no attempt to wound, just clarity, and Ethan accepted it with a small nod, because for once he was not trying to argue against truth. "I am not here to change it tonight," he said after a moment, his voice steady. "I just needed you to know that I see it now." And the words felt incomplete even as he spoke them, but they were honest in a way he had not allowed himself to be before. Ava stopped walking then, turning slightly toward him, her posture straight, her expression calm but firm, and for a second the world around them seemed to slow, the passing lights, the distant noise, everything fading just enough to leave space for what mattered. "Seeing is not the same as understanding," she said quietly, her hand resting protectively over her stomach, and the gesture was not defensive, it was grounding, a reminder of what existed beyond him, beyond this conversation, beyond anything he could offer. Ethan held her gaze, not challenging it, not stepping closer, simply standing where he was. And in that stillness something shifted again, not in the distance between them, but in the way he accepted it, not as something to overcome, but as something that had to be respected, and for the first time, that understanding did not feel like loss. It felt like the beginning of something he had never learned how to do before, listening without trying to lead. The space between them held steady after her words, not tense, not fragile, just defined, and for a moment neither of them moved. The city continuing around them in soft layers of sound, a car passing, a distant horn, footsteps echoing faintly on the pavement, and Ava turned first, not abruptly, not as an escape, but as a continuation of something already in motion, her path clear long before he stepped back into her world. She began walking again, her pace measured, her hand resting lightly against her stomach as if it were both instinct and reassurance, and Ethan followed at the same distance as before, not closing the gap, not trying to guide the direction, simply present in a way that would have felt unfamiliar to him even hours earlier. The streetlights cast long shadows along the sidewalk, stretching their silhouettes in parallel lines that never quite touched, and he noticed that too. The way even the light respected the space she kept, the way everything about this moment seemed to reinforce what she had already said without needing to repeat it. After a few blocks, she slowed near a small bus stop, the kind that blended into the background of the city, a simple bench, a dim overhead light, and a route map faded at the edges, and she stopped there, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder, her movements efficient, practiced, like someone who had done this routine enough times to no longer think about it. Ethan stopped as well, a few steps away, not sitting, not leaning, just standing, and for the first time since he had seen her that night, He allowed the reality of her routine to settle in fully. This was where her day ended, not in a private car, not behind tinted windows, but here, under a streetlight that flickered slightly as the wind moved through it. "You do not have to stay," she said again, her voice softer this time. Not because her stance had changed, but because the moment had, the distance between confrontation and acknowledgement narrowing into something quieter, more honest. Ethan shook his head slightly, his gaze steady but not pressing. "I am not staying to convince you of anything," he said. "I am staying because I should have been here a long time ago." And the words landed differently than the ones before, not as an attempt to repair, but as an admission of absence. Ava glanced at him briefly, her eyes searching, not for weakness, not for guilt, but for consistency, for something that would tell her whether this was just another version of control dressed differently. And whatever she saw did not change her posture, but it did not dismiss him either. A bus approached in the distance, its headlights growing brighter as it moved closer, the low hum of its engine filling the space between them, and Ava shifted her weight slightly, preparing to step forward when it stopped, her attention moving naturally toward what came next rather than what stood behind her. Ethan watched the light reflect off the glass of the approaching bus, then back to her, and there was a moment, small but clear, where he understood that whatever connection still existed between them would not be rebuilt through words spoken in a single night. It would not be negotiated. It would not be accelerated. It would have to exist within the pace she set, within the boundaries she maintained, and for the first time, that did not feel like a limitation. It felt like the only path that made sense. The bus pulled to a stop with a soft hiss, the doors opening in a practiced motion, and Ava stepped forward without hesitation, pausing only long enough to turn her head slightly toward him, not fully, not enough to invite anything more, but enough to acknowledge his presence one last time before the moment shifted again, and then she stepped inside, her figure moving past the threshold into the lit interior, her hand still resting over her stomach as she found a seat near the window. Ethan remained where he was, watching as the doors closed and the bus began to pull away, its movement steady, unhurried, carrying her forward into a life that did not wait for him to catch up. And as the distance grew, he did not move to follow, did not reach for anything that could shorten it. He simply stood there under the dim streetlight, understanding at last that some journeys were not about catching up. They were about learning how to walk the right direction, even if it meant starting alone. The bus lights faded into the distance until they became just another part of the city's moving pattern, red and white reflections blending into the rhythm of traffic, and Ethan remained standing under the streetlight long after it was gone, not because he expected it to return, but because something in him had not caught up to the moment yet, something that had been forced to slow down in a way he had never allowed before. The night air felt sharper now, not cold enough to be uncomfortable, but enough to remind him he was still there, still present, still outside of the life he had just watched drive away. And for the first time in years, there was no immediate next step waiting for him, no assistant to call, no decision to finalize, no outcome to secure, just silence stretching out in front of him with no clear direction. He exhaled slowly, running a hand briefly along the back of his neck, a gesture so small it would have gone unnoticed in any other setting. But here it felt like the only movement that belonged to him, unplanned, unmeasured, real, and as he lowered his hand, his gaze shifted down the street where the bus had disappeared, not following it, not chasing, just acknowledging that it had carried something he could not reach tonight. A car pulled up to the curb behind him, the quiet purr of an engine he recognized before he turned, a driver stepping out with practiced efficiency, opening the rear door with a respectful nod. "Sir," the man said, his tone familiar, steady, part of a world that had always responded to Ethan without question, and for a moment Ethan looked at the open door, at the interior waiting for him, controlled, comfortable, predictable, and something in him hesitated, not out of confusion, but out of awareness, because stepping into that car meant returning to a version of himself that no longer felt complete. He glanced back toward the empty stretch of road, then to the driver, and instead of moving forward, he shook his head slightly. "Not yet," he said, his voice calm but different, lacking the sharp certainty it once carried. And the driver paused, surprised for a fraction of a second before nodding and stepping back, closing the door quietly without question. Ethan turned away from the car, his hands slipping into his coat pockets as he began to walk, not toward anything specific, just forward, each step slower than his usual pace, each movement unhurried, as if he were learning the rhythm of something new, something that did not rely on speed or control. The city around him shifted as he moved, storefronts dimmed, streetlights stretching further apart, the noise thinning into a quieter version of itself, and with each block, the image of Ava on that bus, her hand resting over her stomach, her posture steady, remained clear in his mind, not as a memory to analyze, but as a reality he had to accept, a life continuing without his permission. He passed by a small convenience store, its fluorescent lights casting a stark contrast against the darker street, and for a brief moment he caught his reflection in the glass, the same tailored coat, the same composed exterior, but something behind it had changed, something less certain, more aware, and he did not look away from it immediately, because for the first time, he did not recognize himself as fully as he once had. He resumed walking, the sound of his footsteps steady against the pavement, and as he moved further from the place where he had seen her, he understood something that could not be reversed. He had not just lost time, he had lost presence, moments that could not be bought back or rewritten, and whatever came next would not be about reclaiming what he had missed, it would be about proving, slowly and without demand, that he could exist in a way that deserved to be seen again. Somewhere in the distance, another bus passed through an intersection, its lights briefly illuminating the street before fading again, and Ethan did not turn to follow it. He kept walking forward, not knowing where the path would lead, only knowing that for the first time, he was willing to take it without expecting it to lead back to him. Morning came without ceremony, pale light slipping through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ethan's penthouse, casting long, quiet lines across polished surfaces that had always reflected control, success, and distance. But today the space felt different, not empty, not unfamiliar, just lacking something he had never noticed before, something human, something grounded, and he stood there for a moment longer than usual, looking out over a skyline that had once made everything feel within reach, now strangely far from the only place that had mattered the night before. His phone rested on the counter where he had left it, notifications stacked in silent rows, emails, meeting reminders, numbers waiting for decisions, all of it exactly where it should be, all of it still moving forward without him. And for once he did not reach for it immediately. He did not step into the rhythm that had defined every morning for years. He simply stood there, letting the quiet settle into something that did not need to be filled. When he finally picked it up, his thumb hovered over the screen for a second before unlocking it, not to answer messages, not to call anyone, but to open something he had not looked at in a long time, a contact that had been buried under layers of time and avoidance. And when Ava's name appeared on the screen, it did not bring clarity, it brought weight, because there was nothing simple left between them that could be solved with a call or a message. He closed it again without dialing, setting the phone back down, understanding without needing to test it that reaching out like that would not change anything. Not now. Not in the way he had done everything else before. Instead, he moved through his morning differently, slower, more deliberate. The routine still there but stripped of urgency. A suit chosen without thought, but worn with a different awareness. Each movement carrying a quiet shift he could not fully explain. And when he stepped out into the city again, it did not feel like stepping into control. It felt like stepping into something he had yet to understand. The car waited for him this time, the driver already positioned at the door, ready to open it, and Ethan paused again, just briefly, before getting in, not because he resisted it, but because he recognized it for what it was, one world among many, not the only one that mattered. As the car moved through traffic, the city unfolded in familiar patterns, glass towers, intersections, people moving with purpose, and yet his focus did not settle on any of it. It moved instead through memory, not the kind that rewrites itself to feel easier, but the kind that stays exact. The moment Ava is standing under that streetlight, the way she had said she was not alone, the way she had walked forward without waiting for him to catch up. He leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting from the passing skyline to something closer, something immediate, and then he spoke, not loudly, not with command, but with intention. "I need an address." And the driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror, waiting, And for a moment Ethan did not continue, because this was not a request he had made before. Not like this. Not without a plan attached to it. Ava Carter, he added finally, his voice steady, and the name settled into the space between them, not as an order, but as a direction, and the driver nodded once, already reaching for the system, already moving to respond, but Ethan leaned forward slightly, stopping him before he could proceed. "No," he said quietly, "not like that." And the driver paused, confused for a fraction of a second, and Ethan leaned back again, exhaling slowly, because even now, even with everything he had begun to understand, the instinct to solve, to locate, to control, was still there, still immediate, still automatic. "I will find it myself," he said after a moment. And this time there was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty, just a different kind of resolve, one that did not rely on shortcuts or systems, one that understood that whatever came next would not be given to him. It would have to be earned, step by step, without assumption, without entitlement. And as the car continued forward, Ethan Blake did not look out at the skyline anymore. He looked ahead, not at what he owned, but at what he had yet to prove. The car slowed to a stop at the edge of a quieter part of the city, far from the polished glass towers and curated streets Ethan was used to, and he stepped out without waiting for the driver to open the door, the shift in pace matching the decision he had made, not to arrive with presence, but to move without it, to exist in a space that did not already know his name. The sidewalk here was narrower, the buildings older, their paint slightly worn, their windows reflecting a different kind of life, one built on routine rather than recognition. And for a moment he stood there, taking it in, not judging, not comparing, just observing, because this was a world Ava had been moving through long before he realized it existed. He began walking slowly, his hands in his coat pockets, his eyes moving across details he would have once overlooked, a small grocery store with handwritten signs in the window, a laundromat with the steady hum of machines behind the glass, a child's bicycle leaned against a railing, all of it grounded, all of it real, and none of it designed to impress anyone passing by. He did not ask for directions, did not check his phone. He moved by instinct and memory, piecing together fragments of what little he knew, the bus route, the timing, the distance she had walked, and with each step, the process itself became something more than a search. It became a correction, a deliberate refusal to take the easier path he had always relied on. After several blocks, he slowed near a corner where the streetlights cast a softer glow, and there, across the street, he saw her again, not in motion this time, not serving, not moving through a crowd, but standing still outside a modest apartment building, her keys in hand, her posture relaxed in a way he had not seen before, and for a second he did not move, did not call out. He simply watched, because this version of her, unguarded, not performing a role, felt like something he had not earned the right to interrupt. She adjusted her bag slightly, her hand resting briefly against her stomach as she glanced up at the building, and then she stepped forward, unlocking the door with a quiet motion, disappearing inside without hesitation, without looking back, and the simplicity of it carried a weight that stopped him from crossing the street immediately. He remained where he was, standing beneath the streetlight, looking at the closed door, understanding that finding her was not the same as reaching her, that proximity did not grant permission, and for the first time, that distinction felt clear rather than frustrating. Minutes passed, or maybe it was longer. Time had stopped measuring itself the way it used to, and eventually he stepped forward, crossing the street not with urgency, but with intention, stopping just short of the entrance, his hand resting briefly against the cool metal of the door without pushing it open. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that held private lives behind thin walls, stories unfolding without an audience, and he realized that whatever existed beyond that door was not something he could step into without being invited, not anymore. He lowered his hand, stepping back slightly, his gaze lifting to the windows above, searching without expectation, and for a moment, one light flicked on, soft and warm, illuminating a small section of the second floor, and though he could not see her, he knew. He felt it in a way that did not rely on certainty, that she was there, inside a space that belonged entirely to her. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, but carrying something new, something quieter, and instead of reaching for the door again, He turned, stepping back onto the sidewalk, leaving the distance intact, not as defeat, but as respect. And as he walked away, he understood that this was the first decision he had made that did not serve himself, but acknowledged her. And that was where everything would have to begin. The night settled deeper as Ethan walked away from the building, the quiet hum of the street wrapping around him in a way that felt less distant now, less foreign, as if something in him had adjusted to its rhythm, not by force, but by choice. And he did not look back immediately, not because he did not want to, but because he understood that looking back would not change what he had already chosen to respect. The light in the second-floor window remained on behind him, a small, steady glow that marked a space he was no longer part of. And yet, for the first time, that realization did not feel like something to correct. It felt like something to learn from, something that demanded patience rather than action. He reached the end of the block and paused at the corner, the traffic light shifting from red to green in a quiet cycle that no one rushed. And as he stood there, he let the moment settle fully, not rushing to fill it, not reaching for the next step, just allowing himself to remain in a space that did not require him to decide anything yet. Morning came again, not abruptly, but gradually, the sky lightening in soft shades that replaced the artificial glow of the streetlights. And Ethan found himself back in his office, the glass walls surrounding him with a view that once represented everything he had built, everything he controlled, and yet his attention did not stay there for long. Files rested on his desk, contracts waiting for signatures, numbers waiting to be reviewed, but his gaze drifted instead to something smaller, something out of place among the precision of his environment. A folded receipt he had placed there the night before, the one from the restaurant. A simple piece of paper that carried no value in his world, and yet held more weight than any document in the room. He picked it up, running his thumb along the edge absent-mindedly, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not to escape, but to recall the way she had stood, the way she had spoken, the way she had refused everything he had once relied on, and the clarity of it all settled into something he could no longer ignore. A knock sounded at the door, sharp, professional, and his assistant stepped in with a tablet in hand, already mid-sentence about meetings and deadlines. But Ethan raised a hand slightly, stopping her before she could continue, and the room fell quiet again, the kind of quiet that carried intention rather than interruption. "Reschedule everything after noon," he said, his voice calm, measured, and she hesitated, surprised, because that was not something he did, not without reason, not without explanation, but she nodded anyway, stepping back out of the room without question. Ethan set the receipt down carefully, not as something fragile, but as something intentional, and then he stood, adjusting his jacket, his movements steady, deliberate, as if aligning himself with a different kind of direction. He did not call anyone, did not send a message, did not look for confirmation. He simply walked out, leaving behind a space that would continue without him for a few hours, something that would have once felt impossible. And as he stepped into the elevator, the doors closing with a soft, final sound, he did not feel like he was stepping away from responsibility. He felt like he was stepping towards something that required it in a different form. The city met him again, brighter now, more defined, and this time when he walked, it was not without direction, but it was without urgency. Each step grounded in a decision that did not rely on outcome. And as he moved through the streets, past people who did not know him, past places that did not recognize him, he understood that this was not about finding her again, not in the way he had done the night before. This was about showing up differently, consistently, in a way that did not demand entry but earned presence. And for the first time, that path felt clear, not because it was easy, but because it was true. The street felt different in daylight, the same buildings now revealed in full detail, textures and imperfections visible without the cover of night. And Ethan walked with a steadiness that no longer came from control, but from intention, each step measured not by where he needed to be, but by who he was choosing to become. The neighborhood moved around him with quiet purpose, doors opening and closing, people stepping into their routines, conversations carried in passing, and for once, he did not stand apart from it. He moved through it, present in a way that did not demand recognition. When he reached the building again, he did not stop across the street this time. He approached the entrance directly, his hand resting briefly against the door before pushing it open, the motion simple, unforced, and inside the hallway was narrow, lined with worn carpet and muted light, the kind of place that held lives in close proximity, stories layered behind each door without announcement. He moved up the stairs instead of taking the elevator, each step quiet, deliberate, the sound of his shoes softened by the space, and when he reached the second floor, he slowed, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect for the moment he was stepping into. The hallway stretched in both directions, doors identical in appearance, numbers small and unremarkable, and for a second, he stood there, not searching, not guessing, simply allowing himself to be still, because this was no longer about finding her, it was about how he chose to arrive. A door opened down the hall, a neighbor stepping out with a brief glance in his direction before moving on, and the normalcy of it grounded the moment further, reminding him that this was not a stage, not a confrontation, just a place where life continued without pause. Then he saw her, her door opening quietly, Ava stepping out with a small bag in hand, her movements calm, unhurried, and when she looked up, their eyes met again, not with the shock of the night before, not with tension, but with something steadier, something that acknowledged the distance that still existed while recognizing that it had not been ignored. She did not step back, did not close the door quickly. She simply held his gaze for a moment, reading what had changed, not in his appearance, but in the way he stood there, without assumption, without intrusion, just present. "You found it," she said, her voice even, not impressed, not dismissive, just aware, and Ethan nodded slightly, keeping his distance, his posture open but not advancing. "I did," he replied, and there was no pride in it, no claim, just truth. A brief silence followed, not empty, but full of everything that still needed time, and then he spoke again, his voice steady, grounded in something he had only begun to understand. "I am not here to ask for anything," he said. "I am here to show up differently." And the words settled between them without pressure, without expectation attached. Ava studied him for a moment longer, her hand resting lightly against her stomach, her expression thoughtful, not softened, but not closed either, and then she nodded once, a small acknowledgement. That did not grant access, but did not reject him either. "That takes time," she said quietly, and Ethan accepted it without hesitation, without trying to shorten the distance it implied. "I know," he answered, and for the first time, those two words carried no resistance. She stepped forward then, moving past him toward the stairs, her path unchanged, her direction clear, and as she passed, the space between them remained intact, not as a barrier, but as a boundary both of them now understood. Ethan did not follow immediately. He let her move ahead, let the distance exist without trying to close it, and as he turned to walk in the same direction moments later, he did so not to catch up, but to continue, because this time, the change was not in what had happened to him. It was in how he chose to respond to it, and for the first time, that was something no one could take away.